I'm Bob Kravchuk. I'm a professor of public and environmental affairs at IU Bloomington and director of the Master Public Affairs program. I'm also on the executive committee of the Russian and East European Institute, where I work pretty closely with Mark Trotter and Sarah Phillips, the associate and director. I would like to just spend a couple of moments introducing our panelists this morning, starting alphabetically with Shawn Ron Kovic, who's a senior international trade specialist with the Commerce Department with a great deal of expertise in assisting small and medium-sized enterprises to get established and underway in the countries of it looks like Eastern European, Russia. It's an interesting portfolio: Serbia, France, and Cyprus. Shawn holds a master's degree in public policy from the Hubert Humphrey Institute. Danica Starks, also with the U.S. Commerce Department, is the director. This is a very, very long set of affiliations, but director of the policy team for the Office of Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, for the Global Markets Unit of the International Trade Administration in the Commerce Department. She has a very broad portfolio, including Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, the Caucasus, and Central Eurasia, where you basically have all of the stands, as we call them. She has an MA in International Affairs from Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and is also a graduate of American University. I'm looking very much forward to hearing what our panelists have to say. You'll have a chance to speak. We have about an hour and a half. I'm thinking, 15 to 30 minutes, depending upon what strikes your fancy and what kind of interesting tangents you may go off on. We'll leave some time then for some interactive repartee with the assembled mass here in the President's room. Without further ado, Shawn Ron Kovic.
Okay, well, thanks. Well, thank you very much for, let me grab the microphone. Thank you all for having us. It's our pleasure to be here. As Robert said, I've been in the field for, probably about 12 years now. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of our organization and how we operate and how we try to assist companies and U.S. exporters around the country. Essentially, we operate an international network of probably about a little over 100 offices throughout the U.S. There's folks like myself that are located throughout the country, and basically we meet one-on-one with companies to sort of understand the company, understand what the products are, what they're trying to sell, what markets they're trying to go to, and so we're sort of the first point of contact for that kind of outreach and act sort of as account executives. And then on the overseas side, we have our sort of the delivery unit where we have, typically where there's a U.S. embassy and a U.S. consulate, we'll have colleagues on the ground that focus on commercial issues. So if we're helping a company, for example, and I was just talking to some of your folks, find like a distributor overseas, and I'll tell you more about some of these things that we do, then I can start the conversation here, but then if you're ready and can get on a plane and travel overseas and meet with colleagues, then my colleagues on the ground are the ones that will actually reach out to potential partners and then introduce you and do some hand holding. So that's part of that, and I'll explain more. I'll tell you a little bit more, sort of just so you have a better understanding. But I also want to give you a little bit of understanding of my colleague Danica, who's here. She's with we're part of the same organization, which is sort of our umbrella organization is the Department of Commerce, but we're part of the International Trade Administration. And Danica is part of a group that focuses on policy issues. So when we're talking things like obviously sanctions and anything that the U.S. government and politically engages in, this is where our folks at the sort of government-to-government level deal with these kinds of policy issues. So and she'll tell you more about sort of what they do and how they engage with the Secretary and other senior commerce officials with the governments of Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia in this case. Let me tell you a little bit more, since I think the discussion, we'll be talking about specifically sort of the opportunities and challenges. Let me tell you sort of a little bit more sort of how we can help you. We have these couple markets that we're discussing today. Obviously Russia, Ukraine, geographically a huge area. Population-wise, we're talking about close to 200 million people. We have inhabitants. Russia specifically. Over 15 cities with over a million population. So there are a lot of opportunities. We're looking at obviously the last couple of years have been really tough. We have sanctions in place that are by the U.S. and the EU. I do want to mention that these sanctions are very limited in nature. The embargo, focuses specifically on certain sectors in the energy and the finance sector. So, for the vast majority of our companies and small, medium-sized companies that would want to sell to these markets, for the most part, you're most likely not going to be affected by the sanctions. But you'll have to do some due diligence in the sense that there are individuals that are listed on some of these sanctions lists. So you do want to check some lists before you maybe get involved with a company or a specific person. And so, but you want to do these things anyway, even if you're dealing with other countries, not necessarily Russia or Ukraine in this case. So there's a few lists to check. Our office is a great place to begin, where you can shoot us an email and we'll give you a lot of resources, and you can talk to us every day, because that's sort of what we do. Is every day we get calls on various issues. Hey, how do I fill out my NAFTA certificate of origin to ship to Canada? Or how do I, what Incoterms do I use if I'm shipping on this kind of a basis to such and such country? So these are the types of nuts and bolts questions that we deal with all the time. And then we share these resources. And one of the nice things that our agency has done, there's different lists that are created by different agencies. So you have like the Treasury Department, you got different departments in the U.S. government that have these sort of lists to check. But we've created this consolidated list that makes it really easy, where if, rather than check 5-6 different places, you can go to one place and look for a company name or an individual's name to make sure that they're not on some denied persons list or somebody you should be or not be working with, or are there any flags. So there's resources in place to do that kind of due diligence. And in addition to that, we can always do something as simple as, if you guys give us a call and say, hey, we're talking to a company in Russia these days, but we don't know anything about them. They're wanting to buy from us or maybe be our distributor and so forth. We can do something as simple as shoot an email to our colleagues in Russia and say, hey, do we know anything about this company? Can you tell us? Are they legitimate? Can we do business with them and so forth? And they'll come back, and tell us, because they can do something as quick as like what we would do here, like check the Indiana Secretary of State and just say, okay, is this company even registered to do business in the state of Indiana? They can do something as simple as that. Or, if they've heard any bad news or something in the news, they can share that with us. And so they'll give us some red flags. Okay. If you get to a point where this relationship can grow, they can become a larger buyer, or potentially an official sales rep for you or something. We can do what's called basically a full background check. So essentially, we can. It takes a little bit of time. We do have to actually, for that kind of a service, charge a little bit of money. It costs about $600. For the most part, everything we do, by the way, is paid for by taxpayer dollars. So we typically don't charge for services, but there are a few exceptions where the government says we want you to recover some of that cost, especially if we have to dedicate overseas staff to specifically work on an individual company project for an extended period of time. And a full background check is one of those things where they have to go out, they have to interview people, and actually, when we do those, in addition to sort of the financials, we also send folks from the embassy to meet with the decision makers at those companies to to ask sort of standardized questions that we have, but we can also ask specific questions that the company wants to ask. So that's another way to do due diligence. And like we said, I started talking about the potential for the markets. Obviously, there's a lot of things that we can talk about, challenges, especially Russia. The sanctions have affected the country. I think they're officially in recession still currently economically. But most of these predictions, both for Russia and Ukraine, are actually positive going into late 2016, 2017. And, we'll probably be seeing some growth. Obviously, the exports to both markets have declined. In the case of Indiana, I think probably exports have declined by 3 times, to both markets. Obviously, we sell much more to Russia than we do to Ukraine. A lot of what we sell is similar types of products in both markets. And, things like ag equipment is a big sector. The agriculture sector, aviation, and I was just talking to Jim and his company on Valparaiso does aviation parts. That's another area where actually Indiana's pretty strong. We're not tier 1, tier 2, or even 3, but we are. There are actually quite a few companies in Indiana that supply the aerospace and the aircraft and parts industries in that supply chain. Broadcast equipment is another big sector for Russia. Building and construction. Franchising big. We don't have too many franchises here in Indiana, but Steak and Shake is one of them. We have worked with them. I'm trying to think. Well, there's a couple, but machine tools, metalworking equipment, obviously medical and mining actually has good potential. But here, depending on what kind of equipment you're being asked, you may run into some, if it's energy related, you may run into some areas where there may be some sanctions implications. And if there are things like that, let us know, and we can always try to help out. Robert, you can let me know when to sort of stop. I don't know how much to keep going.
Well, if you get a little bit more to say, keep going.
Okay, I'll so
It's very interesting.
So these are these are some of the things I wanted to mention. I'm not going to sort of go over some of the things that Mark has already talked about. Obviously, there's many issues like corruption, underinvestment in infrastructure. There's the counter sanctions by Russia in this case, as far as food. So if you're basically trying to sell food, there's going to be you're going to run into counter sanctions in that regard. But for the most part, most other products for what SMEs sell these days can be sold. And it's a country where I think the overall GDP size, you look at it, is like the ninth largest economy when we talk about Russia. But when we talk about purchasing power parity, I think they're like in 6th place. Their GDP on a per capita basis can, I believe, easily be compared to something like Chile or Malaysia. So there's a lot of purchasing power there. There's a lot of foreign reserves still. And like I said, probably by late 2016, 2017, we'll be probably seeing growth, and still a lot of room for new entrants in both markets, especially. So there's opportunities, even though we have been seeing some issues, especially with investment and declining FDI in the last couple of years. Government spending is being also cut. IP is a big issue in both markets, like we were discussing with Danica, and in some markets non-existent, not even an understanding of IP protections. But let me see if I want to mention anything else for now. I think I'll stop here for now, and let me just also say that, as of a few years ago, 2012, Russia has joined the World Trade Organization. So this impacts us, and the U.S. has also extended the permanent normal trade relations with the country. So this basically helps because it makes the market more sort of predictable. Commits them to not raising tariffs in certain areas, and so there's the overall trend of doing better with IPR protections and things like that, and more improved transparency. So there are some positive developments. I'll stop here for now. Let Danica talk to you, and then have some time for Q&A. Sure.
Thanks, Dushan. Danica Starks, Commerce Department. Dushan, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to tell our story of how we met.
Oh, sure.
So Dushan and I actually both have Serbian names. My name is, the real pronunciation would be Danica. Means the morning star or the first star. And Dushan and I met over email. And after a few sessions, he said, by the way, do you happen to be of Serbian ancestry? Because my grandmother's name was Danica. And I said, funny that you ask. I'm actually African American, but I actually lived in Bosnia at a point, and people always thought I was some Serbian or Croatian American girl. And he said, well, that's funny because when I talk to people on the phone and I say I'm Dushan, they think I'm African American. So we have this funny thing where, so I started calling him Dushan Jackson. So I call him my Serbian brother from another mother. So it's actually good to be here with him. So thanks for letting me. I just think that's the cutest story. So much for labels. Yeah, exactly. So much for labels. So both Dushan and I both defy stereotyping quite a bit. So Russia, Ukraine opportunities and what we're doing on the federal level. I know a lot of the questions. Some of the things that we're going to be going through will answer a lot of your questions, and you will have some of your own. So I thought I'd talk a little bit more about what I do as opposed to, say, Dushan. So my office, as Dushan mentioned, is the policy and basically the country office, and we have, I would say, about 4 different functions. The first function that we have is entirely within servicing senior officials in the Commerce Department. We are the country-related brain trust for the International Trade Administration, meaning that if the secretary, the undersecretary, any senior officials within the Commerce Department are doing anything related to Russia, Ukraine, any of the former Soviet Union, our office are the ones that are supposed to be following all the political things that are going on, economic changes, liaising with other U.S. government agencies, and making sure that the Commerce Department is where we're supposed to be in terms of U.S. foreign economic policy to the region and U.S. interests. So, for example, last week the Secretary met with the presidents of Azerbaijan and Ukraine. They were in town along with a lot of others for the Nuclear Security Summit. And even though a lot of other offices contribute, my office is the office that actually is charged with briefing the Secretary and any other senior officials. If she goes to Ukraine, other places, we're in charge of putting all those materials together. So we will work with people who are, for example, industry specialists. We'll work with people in the field. We'll work with people overseas. And then we also coordinate among the U.S. government agencies. This can be very, very crucial when you have high-stakes political games. For example, in the case of Russia and Ukraine, the White House is very keyed in. So literally somebody from our office is at the White House at least once a week for some type of meeting regarding the region. So a lot of what we're doing is very, very coordinated across federal agencies. So within the Commerce Department, we are the country brain trust. We also have industry-specific people. There's Office of Financial Services, Office of Energy, Office of Consumer Goods, that type of thing. There are people who are issue specialists, so we have people at Commerce who focus on customs or standards, sanitary, phytosanitary issues. And so we are, again, the country brain trust. The other role that we play is government to government within the U.S. government. Part of what my office's responsibility is to take everything that we know in terms of working with companies such as yourself, input from colleagues such as Dushan, input from our colleagues overseas, and understanding the full landscape of U.S. company concerns and opportunities in the region, and making sure that that's reflected in U.S. foreign economic policy. As you can imagine, with Russia and the sanctions, this was crucial because you have the government and State Department and others very much wanting to do something with sanctions and wanting to use this as a foreign policy tool. But for the Commerce Department, this is directly opposite of what we're trying to do. So one of the roles that we played is sort of like the honest broker between the U.S. business community and what we call the interagency, which means that on any given issue, there are several interagency groupings between relevant U.S. government agencies that will meet to decide how we're going to proceed with that issue. And so in the case of Russia and sanctions, we actually encourage groups like the American Chamber of Commerce in Russia, the U.S.-Russia Business Council, and others, tell us what the areas are that would be most harmful to you. And so what we did was sort of lobby within the U.S. government to try to ensure that while we were effective in our foreign policy and obviously want to support the administration, what can we do to try to minimize the impact on U.S. business? In other words, where can we find things that would hurt Russia the most but hurt us the least? And so we had our number crunchers and other people looking at specific sectors, and we literally had, in some cases, very specific companies come to us and say, you know, we import this particular product from Russia, and it would take us a year and a half to supply this from someplace else, because there's only, 3 other places in the world that have this. And so if you put this on the sanctions list, this is going to severely impact, 50,000 jobs. There were other times where we got input that said, basically there's a specific deal that's about to go down. And in some cases, we were able to actually keep some things off of the agenda that might have been planned. In other cases, we were not successful. So we play that balancing act within the U.S. government of supporting U.S. commercial interests, but also trying to support the broader foreign policy goals. So sometimes I think they think us kind of ruthless because there are countries where we're pressing for human rights and other things. We're like, well, we don't care. We just want to sell things. That's part of the role we play. So we represent U.S. business interests. So the more we hear from you, the better it is for us. So in terms of the connection between, say, Dushan and other colleagues and myself, we end up being a clearinghouse, again, for that country-specific information. Another thing that we do is we do work directly with companies, not as much as Dushan and people in the field, because we are not doing the nuts and bolts with you. So my office is not the office to call if you're trying to figure out how to fill out a form on customs. My office is the office if you call if your stuff is stuck in customs in a foreign country, or if you're facing a very broad market access issue. So in other words, we look at the micro when it becomes macro. So for example, if you're trying to get entry into the market, you're looking at things, then the field offices here and in the overseas can work with you on literally the nuts and bolts. They have people who are experts in the standards and the registration and certifications that you need. Where our office comes in is if we see a trend where, a lot of U.S. companies are getting denied certification for this particular product, or several people's goods are getting stuck on the border. Is there a broader issue that we need to raise government to government? So our office intervenes anytime there is a government-related decision or problem that prevents your company from getting in the market, or if you're in the market and you're having problems, again, that the government could directly be involved in. So for example, if you're shipping a certain product, and like I said, it's being held up in customs, or your patent is being infringed, that type of thing, that's where we would come in, and basically that information is part of what feeds its way into the agenda of, say, the secretary or the assistant secretary when they go on a trip. So in some cases, for example, we had our assistant secretary go to Kazakhstan last year. We had very broad things such as, get the Kazakhs to work on government procurement in general. But we also had very specific things where there was a specific U.S. pharmaceuticals company whose patent was being infringed, and we actually raised that directly at very high levels within the government. So that's part of our job, is to take all of these things, look at the trends, and really fight for market access for U.S. firms. And then when there are problems, especially with people who are invested that have actual brick and mortar in the country, to actually help them if they end up in disputes with the government. I would say the last part that we do provide, briefing and support for U.S. companies, again, looking at the business environment. In a lot of cases, we actually don't have offices in the market. In Russia and Ukraine, we do. But for example, in the Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, and as he mentioned, the stands, we only have one office. We have one office in Kazakhstan. And so for the rest of that, we work in partnership with the State Department, but there really is no commerce people on the ground in a lot of these countries. So that's where my office also helps fill in the gaps. So in those cases, we do end up doing a lot more market counseling than we would for a country where we actually have a full office. So that's sort of generally what we do. In the case of Russia and Ukraine, there's a lot of things we can say. I know we've got several questions that we can answer in terms of what's happening. One of the things that I will say in the case of Russia, don't look to sanctions as the big market barrier entry into Russia. The fact of the matter is we had a lot of problems with Russia well before sanctions started. Even when things were good, we had gotten Russia in the WTO, there was the reset, we had a business development economic relations working group, say that 3 times, the BITERWIG, the worst acronym ever. That the Secretary of Commerce led with the Russian Minister of Trade. There were, I think, 3 governors from Russian regions that came. We had a business roundtable. We had a 5-page, double-sided action plan on everything from promoting investment in both ways to standards, intellectual property rights, full-fledged. And 4 days later, the Crimea invasion happened. But even in that big trade dialogue, there were a lot of very serious issues, local content and other things. In the case of Ukraine, we've definitely ramped up. Ukraine has had a lot of challenges over the years in terms of a lot of the political situation. And so we are actually seeing now, of course, a lot more uptick in work with the Ukrainians on reform, and I can talk about that a little bit more. The secretary herself, I will say, is extremely plugged in. I don't know if many of you know if you followed, but she's been to Ukraine twice in her role as secretary in this last trip. So her name is Penny Pritzker. She's from Chicago, the Hyatt folks. Well, anyway, she went to visit the ancestral village of Veliki Pritsky of her homeland. So she is literally has a personal interest in what's going on in Ukraine. So we've been extremely active there. Anyway, I will stop so that we can move to more specific questions.
So this has already been addressed to some extent in the remarks that we've heard. The first question was how the sanctions in place against the Russian Federation have affected state and federal initiatives in both Russia and Ukraine. And there's a couple of subparts to the question. The first is, in light of the sanctions, has there been a shift to develop broader and deeper ties in Ukraine at the expense of projects in the Russian Federation? In other words, has there been a shift away from Russia towards Ukraine? Maybe we'll take that question first.
Sure. So I can only talk about the federal side. I'll leave Deshawn to talk about any changes on the state level. So have things changed? Yes, obviously. One thing I want to be careful about that question, the idea that our engagement with Ukraine has stepped up at the expense of Russia. I think that's the tricky phrase. I don't know that I would say at the expense of Russia. Because of the Russian aggression, yes, but not at this much the expense of Russia. And the reason I say that is, again, not to beat up on Russia, because it's actually a country that I've spent most of my career covering, and I do love it. But a lot of the issues that we started having with Russia on a government-to-government basis predated the Crimea invasion. So, for example, Russia was already on its way to removing and asking USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, to be removed. And so, for example, we don't do most of the assistance with Russia that we do with the rest of the region. That has nothing to, it's partly to do with the Ukraine situation in that you could say that maybe that was part of some sort of retaliation, but they were on that track anyway. And so there's just a wide swath of government-to-government work that we don't do with Russia that we would be doing with Ukraine or any other country in the region on health programs and other things. One exception is obviously the space program. That is something that has continued working, I think, from what I know, fairly seamlessly. So there's a lot of area that we do not provide assistance. The other reason that we didn't provide a lot of assistance is that Russia, because of its economy, it had graduated to a certain extent from a lot of our technical assistance programs anyway. So whereas in other countries we might still be working to help create legislation and other things, we had gone past that point with Russia already. It was more advanced in a lot of areas. So there are a lot of differences, not necessarily at the expense. In the case of Ukraine, yes, our government-to-government, business-to-government work with Ukraine has probably quadrupled. In terms of the assistance dollars, there's not a direct correlation. In other words, it's not like we took this money from Russia and we put it into Ukraine. The money that's come to Ukraine comes from a bigger pot. I don't know if any of you have dealt with Congress and budget allocations, but you can't just literally move money from one column to the other. So there's no direct correlation between money going down in Russia and going up in Ukraine. The money that went down in Russia got repurposed, and technically those actual dollars could be anywhere. But yes, there is an uptick in work with Ukraine. for what might affect you all, for the most part, I would say in terms of commerce, we've always had a strong relationship. We have something called the Commercial Law Development Program, CLDP. It was founded probably shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall to help the countries of Eastern Europe transition to market economies. CLDP now works all over the world in developing and transition economies. And what they do is they focus on building a legal and judicial regime that will support bilateral commercial relations. So this is everything from training judges on how to adjudicate commercial disputes or how to adjudicate intellectual property rights disputes. They actually work with lawyers in the country to train them on legal processes, train them on how to do oil and gas, modern oil and gas contracting, things that, again, will help U.S. companies long-term get into the market. They work with customs officials on interdicting counterfeit goods and medicines. They work on government procurement, those type of things. In Ukraine, the Commercial Law Development Program actually has a full office because there is, unfortunately, a lot of work to be done in terms of institution building there. We also have an advisor. She technically lives in Georgia, but goes back and forth, specifically looking at trade-related issues, and she basically supports Ukraine's ability to promote good trade policy, both within the region but also with the WTO. Due to the Secretary's interest, we've also launched a couple of working groups. There's an energy working group. There's an agriculture working group. We also have a reform roadmap with Ukraine, again, that's led by the Secretary in conjunction with the President and Prime Minister. And we're working with them on a litany of economic reforms, obviously addressing some of the corruption issues, transparency. Public procurement is a very big issue that we're trying to work with them on, privatization. And we've actually seen some success. We've addressed a lot of U.S. company issues regarding value-added tax, VAT refunds. So the assistance and the government-to-government work that we've been doing with Ukraine has obviously gotten a lot broader, a lot deeper. But like I said, I wanted to be careful that it's not so much at the expense of Russia. Obviously, we're doing a lot of it because of trying to help them in their sovereignty and their independence, but it's not that we necessarily yanked things from Russia to put in Ukraine. A lot of the things that are going on with Russia, like I said, had sort of started before anyway, and Russia was already on a different track, a lot more sophisticated in terms of a lot of the bilateral work that we were doing.
If I could just,
Shawn, anything to add?
yeah, just a quick comment so that we don't forget to mention that, if we're talking at the expense, it's important to mention that in June of 2014, Ukraine signed a free trade area sort of agreement with the EU. They call it the Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Area, and it's part of the broader association agreement. So, some can view this, as if you recall, going back a couple of years ago, there was the whole thing, that before the government changed in Ukraine, the former government said we're not going to pursue our association and try to join the EU. Then the government changed. Now that whole policy has changed, and the orientations toward the EU. They were actually prior to that saying we're going to join the Eurasian Economic Union, which is Russia, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Armenia and Kyrgyzstan. So Ukraine's kind of in between these two worlds. That's why it's actually also an interesting market, because it's going to be inevitably that bridge between Europe, the EU markets, and Russia and Eurasia for that matter. So I think the fact that we're having this conference today is timely in that sense, and those of you that are brave enough to look at these look at Ukraine nowadays, even though it's not the best of times, it's probably the right time. So
can I just add to that?
Sure.
Actually, only about 3% of the territory of Ukraine is actually directly affected by the military conflict with Russia. So the vast majority of the country is actually still open. Such as with Russia, a lot of the problems doing business with Ukraine have nothing to do with the Russians. It has to do with the Ukrainian government itself and a lot of the problems that they've had. So basically, if you were brave enough to go to Ukraine before, you're probably brave enough to go now. Now, I would say, obviously, there are some specific things to be wary of, and if you're doing anything that involves a large-scale government decision or contract, that's where you got to be careful, because who knows what will happen with the government. So you might not want to go into anything where you're waiting on a big government outlay of money for something. The other thing to mention is that in terms of how things changed, we actually still have offices in both countries. In Ukraine, we now have 2 officers and then several locally hired staff. In Russia, we have offices in Moscow and St. Petersburg. I think there are maybe 5 or 6 Americans in our Moscow office, and then another, 6 or 7, 8 locally engaged staff. And we also have an office in St. Petersburg with 1 American and I think 3 or 4. So we actually still, outside of the sanctioned areas, of course, we actually still do all those services Dushan was talking about in Russia.
Before moving on to the next question, I would just like to add to, just in terms of the, thank you, Donita. In terms of sort of the social and political context, Ukraine tends to become much more Western the further you travel to the West. It becomes much, much more Russian the further you travel to the East. One of the unfortunate overlays, however, has been, although this is changing somewhat, is that as you move east towards the more Russian part of the country, it becomes much more heavily industrialized. And so many of sort of potential trading partners actually could be found in eastern Ukraine where there's a very heavy Russian influence. Now this is changing dramatically, and I would say anybody who's been there would notice the changes that are taking place. But in general, what Danita says is absolutely correct. If you're in central or western Ukraine and you've got business partners there, by all means do not let the conflict in the east, dissuade you from pursuing those contacts, because you'll find that business is pretty much normal in those parts of the country. Let's see, the second part of the question, it really had to do with developing commercial networks in Russia and Ukraine. And the question is, could the panelists speak a little more broadly about the difference between American efforts, either at the state or the federal level, in developing commercial networks in Russia and Ukraine? It partially turns on the previous question, but I think it's a nice offshoot.
Sure. Do you want to
Okay,
start?
sure.
Go ahead.
So in general, like I said, we have offices open in both countries that do essentially the same thing. The big difference now is our ability to work government to government. So to the extent that the Commerce Department is helpful, sometimes we are, sometimes we aren't, that's where the difference is. In this part of the world, a large part of the economy is de facto in government hands, whether it is on paper as government or not. So you have things that are purely government, such as government procurement. Then you have the next level being state-owned enterprises. And then you have the next level, which are private enterprises that are actually owned by the wife of the Minister of Health or whatever. And so are effectively government enterprises. And then you have enterprises that aren't necessarily connected to like a family member, but are subject to the whims and pressure from the government. So you actually, having a strong position with the government and the ability to work with the government does make a difference in how we are able to be effective, I guess is what I would say. So I would say in the case of Russia, we try where we can on a business-to-business level in terms of a lot of things that Dushan was talking about in terms of the international company profile and other things. Where it's working with Russian business, I think we're fine. We've been recruiting Russian companies to go to U.S. trade shows and other things. I think where we're more limited in Russia is the government to government. For example, in the case of looking at intellectual property rights or other things, fairly early on in the conflict, the Russian government basically banned us from meeting with Ministry of Justice officials and other things. So, for example, if your business is doing something in industries that affects, we really probably are not the best people to go and talk on your behalf, and you wouldn't want us at this point. I would say that also our ability to do things regionally within the country is probably a little bit more limited, is what I can say. In Ukraine, you're speaking about the East. Even in the East, my boss and our Deputy Assistant Secretary were in Ukraine 2 weeks ago, and they actually went to Kharkiv, which is in the East, and we actually had a very good trip. The government there is very open. They are desperate for people not to see them as generically part of the East. Although somebody did call in a bomb threat while they were there to try to disrupt one of the meetings, but it wasn't a real bomb, so it's fine. We are able to probably do a lot more on a regional level. What I will say, in Russia, we have found that a lot of the regional governors are very proactive, and they actually want to actually keep working with us. So you have places like Kazan and some other places in Russia, where they very much want to be seen as separate from the general bilateral problems. And we still get calls from the Russian Trade Representation, the governor of Bashkortostan or something is coming to the U.S. and can you help? And we're limited in what we can do, but I would say on the regional level, there's still a lot of opportunities. It's just that our ability to go in for you and advocate on your behalf in Russia is more limited than it is in Ukraine.
Shawn?
Sure, we can.
Well, it's very interesting. Danica mentions Kharkiv. When you go from region to region and city to city, you'll find that there may be somewhat stark differences in attitudes and openness. It's hard to argue that there isn't more than one Ukraine or one Russia, especially. I would just relate a very brief anecdote. On our trip to Kharkiv, I had the good fortune to have lunch with the city architect and city engineer, who they were very, very friendly, very open individuals. Being so far east, it was a little bit unexpected. But they indicated that, we don't harbor anything but affection towards Americans. The entire city does. I found it very curious. Well, it turns out at the end of the Second World War, after Kharkiv was overrun, the front line moved between the German and the Red Army something like 30 times. The city was overrun. It needed to be rebuilt from the ground up, literally. The Army Corps of Engineers had U.S. soldiers working in Kharkiv side by side with their Russian counterparts for several years after the conflict. They developed some good ideas, good feelings, and a great deal of affection, and that echo just remains. The vestiges of this goodwill, it's still present on the ground. I would like then, I think, to try to combine. The next two questions are very much related, so perhaps our panelists know, or perhaps someone in the audience would know about the specific organizations or programs in the state of Indiana that would help promote commerce and trade relations between the state, pardon me, and Ukraine and Russia. And this is the combination. Is there much collaboration or sharing of information and resources among these organizations and agencies?
I'll comment briefly. I'll comment briefly. As you know, the state has the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, which changed its name actually some 10 years ago from the Indiana Department of Commerce. So what they also changed back then is the fact that they are primarily focused on inward investment promotion. So the state now, the state of Indiana primarily focuses on trying to get other companies from other countries to open up a shop here and employ workers and job creation and so forth. And they're actually doing an excellent job. We every year in the last few years in Washington, one of the newly formed agencies at the federal level called Select USA that does this large investment summit every year. Some of you may have been, but I know that a lot of the folks from the economic development organizations here in Indiana do go to that every year. And we hear from them that Indiana is actually one of the sort of examples of states that do an excellent job in investment promotion. Now, their focus has been a lot on some of the traditional trading partners that Indiana has. Obviously, Japan is the biggest trading partner for Indiana because Japan has over 250 companies that operate in this state and employ workers. Indiana has a phenomenal relationship, sister cities relationships, and so forth. A lot of missions have gone from here at the governor's level, mayor's level, to Japan and vice versa. The Japan-America Society is very active here of Indiana in that regard. There are other organizations, now the focus is a lot on China. There's also the Indiana-China Society. And India is another area of focus, and some parts of Europe. And they actually have, the state has about 7 or 8 overseas offices that focus on identifying potential companies that they're trying to bring to the state of Indiana. So we've had a great relationship with them. We're at the federal level, they're at the state level, and our primary focus for us specifically is export promotion. So we kind of complement each other in a nice way because they do inward promotion, and when we have leads for companies that do want to invest in the United States, we make sure to pass those leads on to the state, and vice versa. When they have leads for companies wanting to export things, they basically just send them our way. So we have a great relationship in that regard. I do also want to make sure I mentioned that there's another organization here very closely related to us. It's called the District Export Council, actually the Indiana District Export Council. We actually have two of our District Export Council members here. The goal of this organization, it's a nonprofit basically, but the goal of the organization is to support the mission of the U.S. Department of Commerce, which is basically mostly export promotion in this case. And what happens is that these are folks that are identified in the community that like the executive secretary in this case, the director of our office, would sort of nominate and identify, and then the Secretary of Commerce appoints these individuals to serve. And so I do want to make sure I mention Dr. Toby Malachi, who's the vice chair of our District Expert Council. Toby, thanks for coming. And Oleg Ostomelsky, who's going to be on the business panel, is also a member of our DEC. But the reason I mention is because these are also folks, in addition to some of the other resources that we have, that you can always tap into. So like in the case of Dr. Malachi, he's got 35 years of experience of doing business around the world. Oleg specifically for Russia and Ukraine and China with Hoosier Gaskin, and he'll tell you more. But these are folks that, so there's a lot of variety on the deck, and people that are happy to sort of be a resource and act on that peer-to-peer level. So that's what I would mention in that regard.
Just a couple things.
Sure.
Dushan did a great job. I would say that, yeah, the big difference is the cooperation on export promotion versus inward investment. With inward investment, we have Select USA, but we have to be very careful. We are not allowed to promote one state over the other, because Congress people get upset if they think that, you know, we're doing more for, say, Indiana than we're doing for Kentucky. So on inward investment, that's largely at the state level. And Select USA generally helps sort of collect information so that companies from overseas coming in can at least access information even though they can't specifically tell them where to go. So it's more of a one-stop shop. In the case of export promotion, Dushan mentioned things locally in Indiana. From my office's perspective, it's really more when the states come to us. We don't really reach out, I would say, because, again, we can't sort of pick and choose. But when states come to us asking for any assistance, we're very happy to do so. A couple of examples, the DC, Export DC, which is Washington, D.C., it's part of the Office of the Mayor, their export team, they're doing a trade mission to Georgia and Azerbaijan. So, for example, I organized 2 conference calls for them with resources in Georgia and Azerbaijan to help. They're doing events. We help. We'll come speak. We'll talk to companies and do some market counseling. But they reached out to us. And they're partners with our Northern Virginia U.S. Export Assistance Center. There was a group from Pennsylvania that wanted to do a trade mission. So we're happy, if they reach out to us, we're happy to partner with them and to provide support, information, market information, that type of thing. And then sometimes there are very specific things on policy, and I think that's where my office comes in. We'll weigh in. When the sanctions came down, we had a couple of states that actually the governor's office wanted a conference call because they were literally getting investment from potentially people that might have been on the list that were sanctioned. So they were saying, you know, what do we do? You know, a state may call us because, like, again, I say there's a delegation from some random region in Russia that's coming to the state, and they might call us for guidance. Are we allowed to meet with these people? That type of thing. So we're actually very, very happy. And for me, it's a treat to get out of Washington and come someplace different. So I encourage more work with the state.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'm glad Danica mentioned some of the ways we collaborate, because we do that all the time. And if the state of Indiana does a mission overseas, we get involved in various ways. So our colleagues on the ground, you know, we can help put together a reception. We can help them meet with government officials, depending if it's an educational mission, then, you know, folks at the ministries of education. If it's some other industry focus, we do a lot of that kind of stuff. And even at the, not necessarily the governor level, I, for example, worked on a mission with folks down in Evansville. The mayor of Evansville led the mission to Japan and Malaysia a few years ago, and we had some economic development folks. We had some companies. It was a good mix of various sort of partner organizations. So there's a lot of areas where we collaborate at the federal and state level, and even county and regional and other levels. So I'll.
Yeah, well, thank you. The final question really has to do with, I think, a topic that's been already touched on in the remarks of our panelists, and that has to do with specific industries that have been identified in the past and the future as prospects for expansion of commercial relations. And I wonder, just very, very briefly, if there's anything that you would care to expand on what's already been said, just briefly so we can open it up to participation from our audience.
Go ahead.
So I actually stole some slides from a colleague, and I literally have doing business in Ukraine opportunities. So agricultural machinery. Agriculture sector is under-equipped, just like a lot of sectors, a lot of outdated Soviet equipment. Here you have to compete with like a lot of cheap Belarusian products, Chinese product, but subsectors, food processing equipment, including pork processing and packaging, fruit and vegetable production, grain storage and handling, defense equipment. We saw this actually happen with Georgia. When the Russians invaded Georgia, one of the things they discovered is that, for example, their local police forces and their equivalent of like National Guard didn't have the right types of radios for communication. So I think Motorola came in and was able to sell them some radios. So in the case of Ukraine, the conflict has exposed a lot of the lack of sophisticated defense equipment. And this can be everything from, obviously munitions and things is different, but armored vehicles, radio communication, air defense, but also our Office of Textiles actually goes and promotes buying of U.S. Military textiles. For example, we make parachutes and jackets and backpacks and things like that. So just equipping doesn't have to mean, selling people guns. It can also be literally selling uniforms. So safety and security, X-ray systems, scanning equipment for customs, cybersecurity, very little being done there, and medical equipment. Very big public health crisis in Ukraine. Every single hospital is pretty much under-equipped. So medical equipment, emergency medical equipment, operating rooms, telecommunication equipment for telemedicine, surgery, dental equipment, laboratory equipment. Pharmaceuticals, specifically analgesics, antibiotics, anti-cancer vaccines, cough and cold preparations. So basically that whole industry, medical devices, completely empty. Did you want to talk about Russia?
Well, I was going to add, well, I'm glad a lot of these sectors are actually similar for both, for both countries, especially when we talk about, ag machinery and medical and things like that. I do want to mention that, if we get into specifics, and, as you folks, any company out there is encouraged to talk to us on a regular basis. Reach out to us because we're happy to dig into all of these things. When we're talking about sectors, then we'll dig into subsectors. So, like if we're talking about ag machinery, then we'll dig into are we talking about grain storage or cultivators or plows or feed or fodder, production equipment, things like that. Or, if it's medical, MRI, CT scanners and stuff like that. So what we do is we do a lot of sort of market research, market intelligence for companies where we say, okay, here's the product. Let's look at some of the countries that are buying this product. Let's look at some of the countries, let's look at where they're buying the products from. So if it's the United States, who are the competitors? Are the Germans, Italians selling, or whoever. And then, we can add criteria to these things. If we're talking about, safety and security equipment, we can look at like the crime index and rank some of these markets and say, okay, what are some of the criteria that are important? So that's sort of in the first phase. The second phase is, like we said, we have colleagues overseas, and a lot of our colleagues overseas, they specialize in industry sectors. So they have industry portfolios. So when we work closely with a company, then in most of these markets, I'll have a colleague on the ground that focuses on that industry sector. And then that person is the one that we work with if we say, yes, we want to do a matchmaking service where we want you to help us find a distributor in that country. Then that is the person on the ground that will actually go out and reach out to all these companies. And later on during the business panel, Oleg can maybe tell you, because he's utilized our Gold Key matching service and see how that sort of works. And but basically, we'll based on our conversation, based on everything we know, we'll reach out. It could be 20, 30 companies that we reach out to, but we want to try to match you with 4, 5, 6 best potential partners, essentially. So there's a lot of stuff like that. It's very customizable, very flexible, because every company is different, every product's different, and so forth. Every circumstance is different. So that's what I wanted to add to that.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that very interesting set of remarks. I'd like to open it up now to audience participation, and I thought what we would do is, yes, there's a, would you like to, shall I call on them, or would you like to go around with the microphone to whoever? Okay, so Vicki will help with the microphone, and I will stand at the podium and call on questioners. Questions for our panelists? Yes, sir.
Check.
My name's Josh. I work for a language service company here in Indianapolis called Lunar Language Services, and we're integrated pretty well throughout the government and healthcare. So we assist a myriad of different institutions. And I just had 2 questions for you guys. How is Ukraine shouldering the refugee movement, and how is that affecting business over there? And how can a language service company that is based here in Indianapolis that covers over 95 different languages can integrate themselves with companies that are looking to go into Russia or Ukraine?
Okay. Dushan is giving me the you go first look. Okay. So I would say in terms of refugee, it's one of many concerns, but I would say it's not been the overwhelming concern. For places like Donbass and others where they've had people that have had to leave, it has not been at the forefront in the way that we saw, for example, in the case of Georgia, where the internally displaced persons, it was literally just hundreds of thousands of people camping out to police. I think part of it's because Ukraine is just bigger, and so literally you don't have the concentration as much. In terms of the company that you have, I would say positioning is key. You might want to consider doing a couple trips to Washington or some other places where there's a lot of international conferences, where you can meet with clusters of companies that are looking to do business in the region that need that help. So I'm assuming your company provides interpretation services, translation services, that type of thing. You might want to consider a trip to, are your people based here, or are they overseas as well? Both. Okay. So Dushan can talk. You might want to consider doing a gold key to a place like Russia, Ukraine, and if nothing else, putting yourself on the map with the American Chamber of Commerce and others as sort of a shortlisted contractor. So one of the things that happens is, like I said, we have our commercial law development program, for example, and they're doing technical assistance workshops all over the region. They're in Georgia, Armenia, all these places, and they hire translators for all these workshops because for the most part, even if you have people who are English speaking, if you're doing technical things like customs and whatnot, you want to be able to talk to people in their native language. They contract for interpreters all the time. So you might want to consider doing sort of almost a mini trade mission to DC, talk to some of these agencies and things that have these programs all over, or talk to their counterparts overseas like AmTrams and others. Because what happens is a organization like CLDP will come to me and say, hey, we're doing an event in Georgia. Do you know any people on the ground, like our contracting people? We don't have contacts, say in Georgia or Armenia, who get in touch with. You could be put on a short list of companies that get sent the RFP for, say, translation services. What I would say is you're going to have to go out there and hunt those people down, though. So I would consider, and this is something, again, we can talk about, but maybe target a few places where there's a lot of the assistance programs and try to get on their short lists. Because, again, in the case of Ukraine, it's booming because there's so much money going in, USAID and others. There's some sort of program or initiative literally every day, and some of that stuff is happening in the country. We'll actually bring groups into the country. And so I would say getting on their short list is one way to go, and then also getting on the short list directly for companies that need to procure services when they're new to the market.
Yeah, thanks, Danica. I might add to that, any kind of exposure of that sort is great. A lot of our service companies, service providers that we interact with will, get engaged with events that we organize, locally or throughout the country, become marketing partners and things like that. Engaging with these kinds of organizations like AmChams, any kind of Russia, Ukraine, U.S. business councils and these things, that's great. Another thing I did want to mention is maybe even reaching out to the State Department to see what are some of the programs that they have. Because, for example, they have something called the Speaker Program. And the State Department gets involved in a lot of these countries where they have a budget for various things and activities. So like you'll have, say, a local organization in Ukraine that wants to organize an event on sharing best practices on something, whatever. So if you want to be a part of that, for example, and if you have some expertise or know-how that you can bring to the table, for example, in the area that you're involved with, then State Department might want you, to work with them, and might even have money to actually pay for some of your colleagues to fly out there and get involved. So, and we're happy to put you in touch and connect you if you're interested in something like that. So yeah, another thing that I do want to mention is we have what's called a business service provider directory as well. A lot of our overseas, all our overseas offices have local websites where local businesses will come to sort of see what is the U.S. government doing to promote business in the country and connect local companies with U.S. companies and so forth. And then they'll want to advertise. They'll want to advertise, basically their accounting services, auditing services, any kind of consulting services and things like that. And there's interpreters as well. So it's kind of like a local business service provider directory, but one that serves both audiences, the local Ukrainian, Russian businesses, and as well as American companies that are looking to do business in those markets when they, So those are some things yeah.
One more idea, in addition to those chasing the assistance dollars, I don't know if you all have thought about doing basically an embassy sweep in Washington where you go and actually advertise yourself to the different embassies here. A lot of them are severely understaffed. And we actually did a training recently for all of the commercial attachés from the embassies from the region of Eurasia, except Russia, because we couldn't put everybody in the same room, but and one of the things we found, they are looking for shortcuts. In a lot of cases, you have one guy who's doing all the economic and political work, and they want shortcuts, multipliers, and people that can basically fix things for them. And so one of the things that I recommend, depending on the languages that you're strongest in, is, again, take a trip to Washington, and again, we can help you. All of my colleagues have mostly good relations with counterparts, and give these embassies your card and your fee services and say, look, for example, the Uzbekistan embassy, they've done outreaches all over the country. In their case, the ambassadors may speak English, but if they're bringing a delegation of companies, they're going to need interpretation. So maybe giving your card to these embassies, because, hate to say it, but they don't have the same contracting rules that the U.S. government and people have, so they don't have to do the whole 3 bids and all that kind of stuff. If you're in front of them, they can just say, oh, let's call this guy. So it might be worth it to do sort of a mini trade mission just to the embassies, again, of the language that represent the languages that you're strongest in, and say, look, if you're doing events around the country, you have delegations that are coming in. Because they have, in Washington, there's a delegation in town, just of the 11 countries I cover, we've had at least 1 or 2 major delegations in town every week, I would say, in the last year. And they all have interpreters with them. In the case of the State Department, they have I'm sure you're familiar, they have a much bigger procurement system.
And they would probably need written translation, too.
Exactly. The embassies especially, and let me tell you, the stuff that we get from them, they definitely need professional translation services. And we've told them so. Right, and we've told them so. So I would say advertise yourself to these embassies and consulates and say, if you need help.
Right.
That's just an idea.
No, thank you.
Other questions? Mark?
First of all, thank you very much, Danica and Dushan, for a very engaging and enlightening
presentation. I must admit I had never given the Department of Commerce very much thought, but I'm a convert.
Sadly.
I'm a convert now, and I'm so impressed by the scope of your operations, both at the nuts and bolts level and then at the policy kind of level that Danica was talking about. I have two questions, I think probably more for Danica than for Dusan. You mentioned, what was your term here? The country-related brain trust.
Yes.
At Department of Commerce. And I'm wondering, because I come from a academic unit where we have, students who graduate with master's degrees looking for jobs and things like that. What kind of person gets hired to work in your country-related brain trust? What sort of people find their way into that line of activity? And then the second question, you said that I believe only in Kazakhstan of the Central Asian and Caucasian countries do you have a kind of more or less a stationary representative there on the ground. What would it take for commerce to open up other more or less day-to-day offices in those other countries?
Sure. So hiring, well, we actually stole somebody from Indiana, from one of your centers, Rebecca Dash, who's fabulous, and you're not getting her back. She had actually done an internship with us a few years ago when we remembered her. And so when we actually had vacancy, we actually literally emailed the vacancy to her. We're allowed to do that, by the way. The vacancies are on USA Jobs, and so nothing can get past the clearinghouse, but we are allowed to send it out and notify people that it's out there. And so whenever we do have vacancies, I have sort of a short list. I do informational interviews at least once a week, trying to cut down a little bit because it does tend to take a lot of time and things have been crazy. But I talk to graduate students all the time, especially in DC because they're right there. And so I sort of have a rolling resume file just personally that I keep, and when I hear about jobs, I forwarded them to people that I'm like, wait a minute, I just talked to somebody. So in terms of the brain trust, there's a couple different types of jobs. One, the commercial law development program that I mentioned, they've actually been hiring, I wouldn't say like gangbusters, but they've been hiring quite a bit because of the increased assistance money that's been coming through. They've been hiring international program specialists and then also attorney advisors, and they actually have a position out now. In that case, for CLDP, you can't just have a working level language, Russian, you have to actually be fluent because they need people that can actually, call up the Kyrgyz State Patent Agency and arrange a seminar.
Can I just interrupt? When you say fluent, is that pegged to the ILR?
No, it's pegged to the going to an interview and being able to conduct an interview and read an article. For our office, we don't require fluency, we just require a working level. Because we're doing policy, if we're doing anything official, government to government, we almost have to use a translator because you don't want things to get lost. But we need people who, for example, because we don't have time necessarily to hire this gentleman, Josh, right? If a letter comes in from the secretary from the Russian government and it hasn't been translated yet, we just need to be able to quickly look at it and say, oh, okay, this is about blah blah blah, and then we can send it off for an official translation. So you need people who can do that. You need people who can watch the news or get news articles. So we all send each other news articles and say Russian or other things. One of the things that our agency has been debating is how much of the brain trust you want compared to, say, the economic knowledge. It's hard to find people who have the econ side and who have the country knowledge. I would say different offices approach it differently. Some offices, for example, the office that's working on, say, Canada or Mexico, they I think prioritize needing people that know economics and trade because they're dealing with extremely large volumes and extremely sophisticated trade issues. And in the case of obviously Canada, other than French, everybody speaks English, and it's something that people generally sort of know about more. But offices like mine, offices like the China office, we are much more strict in terms of hiring. We need people who speak. So for our office, we require that you speak a language of the region. We prefer Russian or sort of a more multi-useful language. We get a lot of Peace Corps volunteers that are like, I speak, Azeri. Well, that's great, but that's one country, and it's not, and even the Azeris use Russian, for example, for business. We almost exclusively, it's not stated, there's a sort of equivalency chart in terms of degrees versus experience, but I will say in Washington now, for most jobs in the field, you're not going to get in the door without a master's degree. I don't care if you have 20 years of experience on the ground. I don't know that anybody that's been hired in anything related to anything that I do, for example, that doesn't have a master's degree. The other thing is, it's a very snooty, very close-knit field, and I would say that, I'm making this up, but maybe 65% of the people that I get around in meetings with all have a degree from one of 10 universities. It's called, there's the APSIA schools, the American, it's like Association for like International Schools. So it's like American University, Johns Hopkins SAIS, Georgetown, GW, Columbia, Tufts, a few others. Most people have a bachelor's or a master's from those schools. And part of it is those schools are very, very good in terms of their career development. And I would say that's something I would encourage, for example, IU. These schools, for example, I went to AU and Johns Hopkins. I get daily almost emails from their career services saying, we have this student, and they have me in some sort of database that I get picked for trade and I get picked for Russia and whatever, and they're constantly having me meet with their students, asking to speak on panels, that type of thing, and we don't get that as much from the other schools. Texas A&M, though, for example, has like a Washington semester thing that they offer where they basically have their students come. So they've actually started establishing a presence. But I would say master's degree and language. Peace Corps is nice, but the problem with Peace Corps is that you don't learn sort of everyday business skills. So it's great that you know how to dig a well, but that really doesn't help, in terms of writing a briefing paper to the secretary. So I'd say people that do Peace Corps still need the master's, and then I would say people, as part of their degrees, to have some sort of thing that they focus on, whether it's international law, whether it's trade. There's no such thing as a generic job of international relations unless you maybe go into, say, the foreign service where you move around. Everybody does something very specific. So you want to work on human rights, you want to work on press. You can't just get a general degree in international relations and find a job. That's very hard. So the people who are more targeted, I would say. Sorry, that was very long.
No problem.
So I'll let Deshaun talk about the field office and what they want.
Right. Mark, was part of your question sort of why we don't have offices in some of these countries like Azerbaijan, or is that? Yeah, I mean.
And what would have to happen?
In some cases we did.
Right. And that's primarily, driven by by the level of commercial activity that the United States has with those countries. And when we run these resource allocation models, actually we have third-party companies that do that for us, and we do that from time to time, both throughout the U.S. and overseas, to assess, okay, do we have the right amount of people and staff in some of these places? And like Danica said, some of the countries we've had offices, closed them down, and then transition some of those resources. Like say Germany had 6 offices at one point. We realized we might not need 6 in Germany. Maybe we're okay with 4, but we could then open an office in somewhere in like Northern Africa, for example, where we might need some additional help. And we're realizing we need more and more help in places like Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, places that we used to service from, like, say, Kenya, but we're realizing we're getting enough requests of companies wanting to go to these places. So rather than to rely on the State Department, which is not quite, they're just not set up to offer the amount and level of services, personalized level of services that we do to individual companies, they can help for sure. And with our guidance and collaboration, they usually do a good job in getting back to us and helping us find contacts. But it's always better when we have our folks on the ground, because then everything's more expedient, more efficient, and so forth. So that's sort of what drives that for the most part. We're looking at China. China's expanding enormously. It's our busiest post. So what we've done in places like China, we've even, in addition to some of the physical offices that we have, we've even reached out to some local organizations who help us extend our reach. So basically, we can now say we have over 20 offices in China, where we can offer a service like matchmaking service or a due diligence service and things like that. So.
I just wanted to add, the other problem with Caucasus and Central Asia is our offices are solely to help U.S. Exporters, and now with the Select USA to help attract investment to the U.S. These countries overwhelmingly want FDI into their countries, and we do not promote direct investment. The Commerce Department, when you do hear bad things about us, they're shipping away U.S. jobs. And so we get in a lot of trouble. We have to be very careful. Even though we support U.S. investors, in other words, if you're already there, we support you, we have to be very careful. And unfortunately, most of the model that these countries are following is they want brick and mortar FDI. And they want a commerce office because they think that means we'll send a plane full of CEOs to open factories. But in fact, we're trying to sell things. And so these countries don't buy as much as they want investment. So that's the other problem with an office, is that we have sort of cross purposes. And they're not interested in buying. They prefer to try to attract investment. And because that's not really part of what we do, it would limit the scope, but I think create a lot of frustrations. And so even though I would personally prefer to have people on the ground, I think that might be a long time coming. I have been pushing to get somebody, say, in Georgia, because from Georgia you could cover Armenia and Azerbaijan. And in Central Asia, like I said, we have these partnership post arrangements with the State Department, but in places like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, where there's like 3 U.S. companies, it just doesn't make any sense.
Sorry.
Quick question, and Deshaun already knows what I'm about to ask because I have asked this before, and it was brought up by Mark indirectly. Mark made a comment that he was unaware of what the United States Department of Commerce does. Neither is 99.3% of the U.S. public. In fact, the Department of Commerce is probably, and Deshaun has heard me say this before to a number of people at the Department of Commerce, you guys are probably have the lowest profile of any government agency in the United States, including the CIA, which should not be the case. I've seen your name as a department misspelled as Department of Congress on one occasion.
Oh my God.
And
Chamber of Commerce?
Chamber of Commerce, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So here's my question. You guys provide a great service, in my opinion. I'll speak about it when it's my turn to speak. I have utilized them, you guys extensively, as Dushan knows. But at the moment, at least, your services help those companies who need their help the least, because they all know where to reach. I know who to call in Washington, D.C. I know who to call in Russia. I have on speed dial half of your officers throughout, seriously, throughout the Eastern Europe. I've been to the embassies in Budapest and in Kiev, in Moscow, and so on. How does someone who does not have that background, who does not know that information, find out where to get in touch with you? In other words, when are you guys going to start advertising?
Yeah.
When are you going to advertise? You do not have an advertising budget, and you need one.
Yeah.
In order to reach out more of your potential clients,
Yeah.
more of businesses like our business and businesses represented in this room, you need to advertise.
Yeah.
When are you going to start?
So I think part of the problem is, if you listen to, for example, some of the various political candidates, commerce as a whole, I think, is different than, I think part of the problem with the Commerce Department is it has so many very independent agencies within it. So, for example, the Census Bureau is part of the Commerce Department. So you know census, but they don't brand themselves as the Commerce Department. They're branded as the Census Bureau. I used to work for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, another organization that's underbranded. I mean, they run the National Weather Service, all the things, and you don't see them as much. Part of the problem that ITA specifically, which is what you really mean, International Trade Administration has, is a lot of Congress people don't think we should exist. They think that we're doing something that the private sector should be doing. Our argument is that, especially for markets like this, where the private sector isn't there yet, you actually need the bridge. The other argument is that in governments like China or Russia, where there's so much of the economy in state-owned hands, you just can't do it all private sector to private sector. You need that government-to-government relationship. So part of the problem that we have is that there's a large group of people that really think that we shouldn't exist because we're not the Social Security Administration, we're not the Veterans Administration. So the idea that it put groups that have to sort of be there because they're providing these services. So you're right, we don't get a lot of budget for advertising. We also, surprisingly, don't get a lot of budget as much as you might think for travel. Domestic travel, I do very little domestic travel, partly because, budget, but then also, again, looking at, mission, they say, well, we have an office in Indiana. Why do we need to send Anika to Indiana? We have somebody there. It's something that internally, from a staff perspective, we've been struggling with. We're going through this Vision 2020 thing, and that's something that I've been planning to raise. So I completely agree with you. I think we're very, very under branded, but we're fighting against a tide where there's a lot of negative opinion that basically we're doing things that should be that this should be like a private sector operation that does this, and we have to be careful that nothing that we do replaces the private sector. So that's part of the problem that we're having. And if you elect Donald Trump, he said he was going to get rid of us, right?
No, he didn't.
No, there's a couple of them that said that they were going to get rid of us. Cruz, yeah, and some others. So who knows? But that's the problem. It's sort of bigger than my pay grade.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you asked the question, Oleg, because it gives me an opportunity to say something here, and also sort of give you an idea of a few other resources that we haven't mentioned but that are out there. There was an initiative a couple years ago during this administration, actually. There are probably about 20 agencies, at the federal government level that do some sort of trade promotion. We're sort of the frontline trade promotion agency for the U.S. government, the ITA, International Trade Administration within Commerce, right? But there are agencies like the Export-Import Bank, and some of you may already, be talking to these folks and be utilizing them. Export-Import Bank, for example, is a great, and we didn't have time here to talk about things that they do, and some of the trade finance tools that they offer, where you can basically insure your overseas receivables. You can take out the risk from your international transaction. These are great tools, and in some other opportunities we might be able to talk about things like that. There's the SBA, for example, that does export working capital loans. So if you have like a potential export transaction that with a company overseas, and say your lender is worried to your bank is worried to lend you money because they don't know anything about this foreign buyer, but then the SBA can step in and guarantee that loan to your bank. And now, 90% of the risk of the transaction is taken out, and you can buy new equipment or hire more workers to, help support export. So there's tools like that. The Overseas Private Investment Corporation is another agency, the U.S. Trade Development Agency. So there's probably about 20, that do a lot of things. And there was an initiative a couple of years ago to basically combine all these agencies into one. And basically call us something like the U.S. Trade and Investment Agency, which probably would have resolved our branding issue, not just for us, which is obvious because, you know us as the Department of Commerce, somebody else knows us as the U.S. Commercial Service, somebody else calls us the Export Assistance Center. So, all these people, something, they'll call, I'll pick up the phone, I'll say, U.S. Department of Commerce. Well, I thought I reached the Export Assistance Center. Well, yeah, you did. So we have that issue, but a lot of these other folks do too. And hopefully maybe in the future, of course, if we're not gone, because, every so often you have a candidate, we'll get rid of the Commerce Department. Yeah. Well, that's usually what happens, when they run for office, when they come into office and realize all the things that the government does actually do, then those stories go away. But that was my comment.
And I would say, and also, talk to your Congress people, write to your Congress people. They hear about all the negative things, but they don't hear about the good things. I think in terms of a lot of the travel and outreach, I would say that, was it the GSA conference in Las Vegas with the mind reader and whatnot? That severely limited our ability to travel. Everything we do now is scrutinized. It took, my travel orders to come here are 10 pages for a less than 24-hour trip. 10 pages of justification and lawyers. I had to get an ethics thing. And it's because they're so paranoid now. And so you just can't, and so they are scrutinizing all travel. And especially now that it's an election year, they're particularly scrutinizing domestic travel because they don't want people basically campaigning on government budget. Now, I'm not political, I'm career, so I don't have to deal with that as much. But the travel, unfortunately, is very heavily scrutinized, and we get screwed both ways, because on one hand, if we travel on government money, then we're wasting U.S. taxpayer dollar by going on a boondoggle. But if we accept, a gift of, say, an accommodation or a flight, then it's, we're accepting a bribe. I mean, so, we struggle to really try to provide coverage, but we are very underrepresented at events like this. There should be a Commerce Department person at every single doing business with the fill in the blank thing around the country. But unfortunately, as Vicki knows, and just working to get me here, because of the atmosphere and the not wanting to get on the cover of the Washington Post for corruption and things, it is actually very difficult from Washington especially for us to get permission to travel.
I think Toby Malachi will have the last question.
Oh, thank you. A comment and a question for Danica. We're going to miss Shawn, the brother from another mother. We've had him for 12 years, and I'll tell you, DC's getting a great man, great human being. And we're fortunate to have him here in Indiana with us. I know a little bit about Washington, D.C. In all my 35 years, and he's really is a breath of fresh air, and anybody in the organization needs someone to talk to that you'll get a straight answer and one with integrity and ethics and doesn't want anything in return. Shawn is the guy, so we're going to miss your brother. And for Danica, we're glad we're here. Hoosiers, we have a thing called Hoosier Hospitality, and we all work as a team. Vicki, all of us, we all know each other, and so I understand you like our Lucas Stadium.
Oh,
You're
awesome.
a football fan. So next time you come, you get here, without the 10 pages, we'll see that you get a tour of our excellent football stadium. My question is, although I'm a Hall of Famer, IUPU out here in basketball, I'll see that you get that tour.
Nice.
My question is, I'm a former board member also of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and
Okay.
served on the policy committee for 13 years. Can you maybe talk a little about to the group just briefly, when you're setting policies? I was actually sitting in the White House when the president got turned around. He was supposed to sit right beside me, got turned around on that. You prepped for that meeting. I was actually at that meeting waiting for you to come in and the president to come in. Can you speak a little bit about, when you set policy, how you may use the U.S. Chamber of Commerce,
Sure.
European group, and also the ITEC, the Industry Trade Advisory Committee?
Oh, that's excellent questions. So U.S. Chamber and ITEC. So I have a very relevant example of how we've used the U.S. Chamber. So Gary Littman is the vice president that covers our area. The chamber is not as dialed in on sort of Eurasia as some of the other parts of the world, just simply because they go where the dollars go, right? So they're very focused on China and other places, but we have been able to engage with them quite a bit recently. So a couple of big things. Last year we held a U.S.-Ukraine business forum, and we actually signed an MOU with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to do that forum. Partly because by having the chamber formally be the co-host, again, because of all of our ethics rules and things, it's a lot easier for us if another organization sometimes can take over in terms of helping with invitations and other things, because government contracting and whatnot is just, it's a nightmare. So the chamber is a very good partner because we can help bring, again, the foreign government, U.S. government officials. So, for example, Vice President Biden came, Secretary of Commerce, I think Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury. So they get the benefit of, because the Commerce Department is behind it, we're guaranteeing, in that case, cabinet level support. But the chamber also can help in terms of, they have the staff to do a lot of the logistics, and they have the freedom, again, in terms of the contracting and the network of U.S. companies. So the chamber, in that sense, has been very helpful. Another area where the chamber was very helpful, when the Russians invaded Georgia in August 2008, we wanted very quickly to do something in support of Georgia, and I approached the chamber and said, hey, could we do a Georgia Day at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce? It cost very little money. I think, we made it like a breakfast thing, but again, we got the Secretary of Commerce over there and, had basically a press conference, brought in actually some of the U.S. companies that were part of the American Chamber of Commerce to come in. That's the other thing, is the chamber is affiliated with the American Chambers of Commerce overseas. They pay a sort of a fee to be affiliated, and the chamber will have conferences where they'll bring in by region, like the European chambers and whatnot. And so it's also a great way to connect with the U.S. business community that is resident overseas. I would say for my region, we work more actually with the bilateral chambers of commerce. So there's AmChams that are in the country, but in Washington, there's also, for example, the American Uzbekistan Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Azerbaijan Chamber of Commerce. And for markets like that, where you don't have the scale that you do They actually tend to be our closer partner rather than the chamber, because again, the chamber is focused on more of the bigger markets. So the bilateral chambers, which are not affiliated with the U.S. Chamber, tend to be our closest partners, U.S.-Russia Business Council, that type of thing. So we probably work on a day-to-day basis more with those guys because they are focused on, very specific countries. In the case of the ITEC, for those who don't know, international trade and well, there's ITEC and ITAC. There's two. So the ITEC is the International Trade Enforcement Committee, and the ITAC, you're talking about the International Trade Advisory Councils, ITAC? Okay. So International Trade Advisory Councils, ITAC, basically these are councils that compose of private sector representatives by industry. So we have ITEC, 1 might be, aerospace, ITEC 2 might be industrial goods, ITEC 3 might be travel and tourism. And there's a process through the Federal Register whereby companies can basically nominate, put themselves up for nomination, and they get selected, and they form a trade advisory council to the Commerce Department and the U.S. government, where they basically tell us how they feel about things like TPP and other trade agreements, and then they get briefed on what we're doing. So in the case of ITEC, because of all the, especially when Russia was getting into the WTO, a lot of interest, I actually brief ITACs probably once every couple of months. It depends on who's running the ITAC and their interest. So the industrial folks, the machinery and equipment, they are very much interested in this region because of the ag equipment and other things. So they always ask our office for a briefing. So I see those guys, I think almost every time that they meet, myself usually or somebody else in my office, usually me, will brief them. Some of the other ones aren't as interested. Sometimes we'll go one time and we'll talk for 10 minutes and they're like, okay, and that's the last I hear of them. But it's very useful for me because, again, it's a whole room full of U.S. companies. You get a chance to talk about what you're doing, and then they get a chance to feed in. So, for example, with the sanctions issue, they were a very good resource for what we should or should not be doing in terms of advice. So the ITACs have been very helpful, and we're trying to encourage the governments of the region to do similar things because they do not tend to listen to the business community. So, for example, in Ukraine, the EBRD, which is the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, that is the U.S. is the largest donor to, they are actually developing an investor council for the Ukrainian government to basically function similar to the way the ITACs do to the U.S. government.
Well, I was just going to thank.
And Dushan is awesome.
I was just going to thank Dr. Malachi for the kind words. And, for those of you that may not know, I've spent the last 11 years here in Indiana. I got to see in person and experience the Hoosier hospitality. I'm very grateful for that. Literally in the last few weeks, I've accepted a position with our headquarters. So this program was planned before any of that took place, which is why I came back for this event. And actually, we have another event tomorrow in China at Butler University, and that's another one we'll be supporting. I'm not speaking there, but we're supporting the event. And just want to thank you for that. But you do have resources still here. Mark Cooper, who was here this morning, he had to leave for a meeting. He runs the local office. He's the director. We're in the process of hiring more folks. He's got some folks that we've hired recently. And like I said earlier, the district expert council members, who some of whom are here, Dr. Malachi and Oleg. And also we have another DEC member that joined us just recently, Dennis Kelly in the back. So thanks for joining, Dennis. So these are resources that are still here. And if any of you need to, are looking at overseas markets, any kind of individual support, it's still very much present in Indiana. So thanks for that, Doug.
Can I just say real quick? I did experience the Hoosier hospitality. As Vicki knows, so my flight here got canceled. And then the next flight was sold out, and I was on standby, and they couldn't get me on it. And then the flight that I was on was delayed for an hour. Dushan picked me up from the airport at 11 o'clock last night.
Wow. Man.
I was happy to.
Well, thank you, everyone, for a very interesting panel session. I'm going to be very, very brief. No, I'm not going to say anything else. I'm standing between you and lunchtime, so thanks very much, and I look forward to the afternoon panels.